And so the first item on the agenda would be administrative review. I'm not terribly familiar with what this is about, so I'd like to just kind of an overview with this ordinance. The objective is number one. The second part is application of it. And then the third part would be execution.
I don't know if she can hear.
Should be able to. I'm not muted anymore.
I can hear you.
Rebecca, did you hear what Mike just said?
No, well, I mean, I heard him, but were you talking to me? I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead and do it
Yeah,
again.
so Rebecca, under the first item for the agenda, administrative review. First, I'd like an understanding overview of what the objectives of that ordinance would be. The second would be the application of it, and the third would be the execution.
Okay, on the administrative review.
Sure.
Okay, and you have my list of questions as well, correct? Okay, great, thank you. All right, so here's starting with the administrative review. So what I did with this list of questions, I did have the opportunity to speak with Carol and Kathy on these three topics to get an understanding of what the township was looking for, or what the maybe what issues the township has been experiencing, or what it was they were trying to achieve. So that was a really helpful conversation. So I wanted to sort of have that at the staff level. And then honestly, I kind of wanted to have that same sort of conversation with you. So under the administrative site plan review, what I've done, the way I've sort of constructed the questions was the first couple of things was to recite to you my understanding of kind of what it would be. And then I actually wanted to ask you, interestingly, what it was you were wanting to achieve with it, because then that will make a difference as to how I construct it. So when I'm thinking of an administrative review process, essentially, when you find that in an ordinance, that is typically applicable to existing uses or approved site plans. So it does not replace planning commission review of, change in uses and that kind of thing. It is simply a provision in the ordinance that allows for administrative review of minor changes to either existing uses or previously approved site plans already approved by the planning commission. Now, what constitutes a minor modification to a plan is then you kind of construct that provision in the ordinance to provide the parameters for that. And what I did as the second bullet point under this, where I indicate eligibility for administrative site plan review, my thought was to, these are kind of typical parameters for what would trigger that. So sometimes you will see that they have a percentage of a building expansion. So if you have an approved project or an existing project, they're proposing to expand their building. And but it is a small expansion. And in this case, I suggested 25%. So it's not increasing the size of the building by more than 25%. And assuming it complies with all of the dimensional requirements, then that can be considered a minor revision and would be eligible for an administrative review. If it's something that does not trigger changes in the driveway arrangement, maybe they're going to restripe the parking lot or add some parking, but it still complies with everything and is not changing driveways, that also typically will qualify. Sometimes if you're going to shift, now that would be shifting a building might be for an already approved site plan. They've gotten it approved, but then they decide they're going to do something to accommodate a utility, or sorry, it would be something that would trigger planning commission review again. And then sometimes a little bit broader statement that simply says site changes that don't materially affect the intensity of use, which gives the staff a little bit of latitude. You know, modification, there's all different kinds of modifications to plans. And typically what a staff person is looking for is these parameters, and it has to be something that complies with the ordinance, and it has to be something that is not contrary to already to a condition of approval. So let's say you guys had granted site plan approval for a plan and had established a condition of screening along one of the property lines. Then if an applicant came back and said, okay, here, I want to modify that screening along that property line. Okay, that's not something that can be administratively modified. That was a condition of approval imposed by the PC. Only the PC can change it. So those, you know, that's a standard set of parameters. You know, a community can make those standards or parameters whatever they want. But what I wanted to put in front of you was just kind of a typical approach that you'll find in an ordinance. And that way it gives you sort of something to react to as to, you know, what that might look like or how that might work. Now, the third bullet point then are desired outcomes. And this was really me asking you guys, you know, what your objective is, because I can tell you when communities have administrative site plan review procedures, they're usually doing it because they're attempting to achieve something. You know, site plan review is an administrative function. Some communities have it strictly at the staff level. Now, I don't know that that's preferred. I actually prefer the planning commission doing that as a major administrative function. But a lot of time communities will build this administrative element into it to just make the process a little more streamlined, make it not so lengthy for an applicant who's really not changing the intent of anything, but they're simply making some minor modifications or modifications that don't really change the intent of your approval. And it also has the ability of saving time and money for an applicant and for the community. So it's one of those approaches, I think, that if a community is kind of looking at the process and saying, you know, how can we want to make sure our ordinance is complied with, and we want to make sure that you know, our ordinances are still met and that the process is respected. But how do we provide for an easier path for a person to go through that process? And so this is kind of this is a standard approach that is used. So my questions to you are, you know, what are you thinking about that? Why are you considering this? Is this something that you're attempting to achieve? Are you, you know, so that would be helpful for me.
I think this is something that was brought up at the ZBA because you all have so many convoluted issues and the process is so long that having the administrative site plan review with you would help you all a lot.
I think we've discussed it a number of times, the minor different things, people want to rebuild a deck, putting it on the same footprint, that shouldn't come in front of us, there should be an administrative review. There's a few other issues like that, changing this, changing that, or something that's approved, and still going to step back, so they're not expanding anything. So it can be used, I think, probably several times a year, probably how often it will be used. I don't know how far you carry administrative review. You're not gonna allow somebody to go further into a setback. You're not gonna allow somebody to violate the fire place.
I think what you're saying is something that we could include. Can you hear what he's saying?
Not as clearly. I can hear you very clearly. I only heard about half of what he said.
What I said is Carol and I have discussed a number of times.
Steve, can you talk to the microphone? Sorry. That's better.
I wanna hold on to it, I'll start singing. And you'll all leave. So, anyway, there was a certain thing that we had, over the last few years, with decks, people wanting to rebuild the deck. Tearing it off, putting up a new one, I mean, that's administrative review. As long as it's not impeding other people's views, I mean, there's a lot of decks and stuff out there that have never been approved, and they just put up. So you kind of want to look at that. But if they're in setbacks and stuff, just a lot smaller, that's an easy thing to do. Like I said, that's 2 or 3 times a year that we're trying to think some other incidences that we review, it would be just an administrative review. You're not gonna expand the setbacks.
We don't see this one too often, but what if you replace the house in the exact same footprint? You know, should they have to go through the whole variance process and the cost and everything?
Well, I can't remember the last time we saw someone build the exact same house in the exact same footprint. They always want to go upstairs.
Yeah. But that would be, but that might encourage somebody to say, oh, you could replace your house in the exact same footprint and push this through. If you want to expand it, encroach into setbacks, encroach in your neighbors, you're gonna have to go through the full ZBA process.
Now, you guys don't, now I know you're just bringing up examples, but you don't typically subject a single family home to your site plan review process, correct?
No.
Right. Yeah, most communities do not. That would be, so, so similarly, a deck on a single family home wouldn't be subject to your site plan review process either, right?
Not through planning commission.
Right, yeah, okay. Yeah, the fact of the matter is I don't, how many would you say, how many because normally site plan reviews are either conducted because the use is a special land use, right? And by law, you have to do site plan review with a special land use. Or it is a non-residential use. Because usually single family or 2-family homes don't require site plan reviews. So how many site plan reviews would you say the planning commission conducts every year?
I would say 4. And
Okay.
and often I would say out of those 4, there might 4 to 5. And out of that 4 to 5, there may be 2 that are coupled with a special use. So
Okay,
what I allow them to do is make one payment, one application for both.
yeah, well that makes sense. So you guys, with that said, you're probably not going to see this administrative site plan review process triggered, super frequently, because if you're actually conducting site plan reviews maybe 4 or 5 times a year, and some of them have to do with special uses, most likely those aren't going to trigger the administrative review. And if it's a new site plan, they have to come before you anyway, right? When there's a change in use or something else. So really this administrative process is a mechanism. It's a great tool to have in your ordinance. I mean, I think it's great that you guys are considering it, because it is the way that it makes it easier for the person who's trying to go through the process. It makes it so much easier. So I'm glad you're looking at it, but the fact may very well be that you guys don't see a huge change in your, in how you do business, because you may very well only get a couple every year that qualify for that. But still, I mean, even if it's just one, my gosh, I'm sure that applicant would love that.
So maybe we need to ask the question differently, back to Steve's point, is that, so from the zoning board administration, they got this decker and these other related issues, right, that they need to deal with. Is there a different ordinance that would give them the ability to, take some of the pain away from the homeowners and do, all the, going through the typical building approval process?
Would this apply to, you didn't hear she can't hear you. Would this apply to, ZBA as well as planning commission, Becky?
No. The ZBA doesn't conduct site plan reviews, only the planning commission. So, now, the ZBA is looking at a site plan or a sketch plan, right? When they're considering the application in front of them. But if it's before the ZBA, it's because they're being asked to consider a request for variance approval or an interpretation or something. And so, the administrative review process is not going to take any of, it's not going to trigger any of the ZBA's work.
So that was one of the things, I'm sorry, I'm gonna jump in. That was one of the things that Rob Dahl had suggested when I have talked to him on certain projects that the ZBA has reviewed, like Steve was mentioning, a deck. That it was awful that we needed to make the people go through the ZBA process for a variance because they had they complied with the front yard setback. They complied with one side yard setback, but there was the other side yard setback, instead of 20 feet, they had a pre-existing 18 feet. And so when I talked to Rob Dahl about it, he says, yeah, they still got to go to ZBA on it. That's the kind of stuff that we make them go through all this process and hassle for just to add, they wanted to add on 4 feet to their deck, but the deck already encroached 1.5 feet.
Yeah, well, so, I totally get what you're saying, Carol, but, so I would say that first of all, is this likely to occur on these waterfront properties?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay, that is a whole bigger issue, and we're going to talk about that. But let's say it had nothing to do with the lake properties. Let's just say we were generically talking about someone wanting to come in and seeking relief from a dimensional requirement. I think the lens you have to see that through is that whether there's an existing building there or not, if the standard, whatever the standard is, the township, and in this case, the zoning board of appeals, honestly, their position has to be, that's the standard that the planning commission and the township board have decided is the standard that is necessary in order to effectively implement the master plan. Right? Because every standard is designed to achieve a particular thing. Otherwise, they would just be arbitrary numbers. So you have a set of standards, and in a particular district, the planning commission has said, yeah, here's what we're trying to do within this district. And in order to accomplish that, these are the setback standards. So you have to go into it with that sort of position. And so then you can't look at a request to vary that standard as, some sort of imposition because they already have a lawfully non-conforming structure. Because really, you should be looking at it and saying, yeah, you're already encroaching into this thing, into this setback area that we've said we need, that is necessary for this district. And so the variance, the ZBA is gonna be looking at it, not as to the reasonableness of the request, but they're gonna be applying their, variance criteria and determining whether or not, they're going to allow an additional encroachment, because even if they're not reducing the setback, you know, let's say it's, the requirement is 10 and they're already 8 foot, and they just want to add on to their deck another 4 feet, but the 4 feet will also be 8 foot. That's considered an encroachment because they're putting more of the deck into that setback. I would say that if the planning commission is standing back and watching that and saying, gee, that seems really unreasonable, because we have a lot of buildings or decks or, you know, structures, what have you, that don't comply with the setback standard that we've established for that district. And if you're thinking that it's unreasonable to make them comply, then you should be looking at your standard. The PC, not the ZBA, but the PC should be looking at that and saying, you know, we think that's, if you think that's unreasonable, then you look at it and you do one of two things. You either change your standard and say, instead of 10 feet, and we know most of these things are set back, you know, between 5 and 10 feet, then maybe you change your setback standard to 5. I mean, that's how you address that. However, if you firmly believe that the appropriate setback is 10, and of course your view always on non-conformities is that there will be eventual conformity, right? I mean, that's what a conformity is that you eventually, that's why you don't allow it to expand or anything else, is because your theory is that eventually you will get compliance with this standard that you have decided is appropriate. And so that's why you don't allow it to continue and expand, or I shouldn't say continue, expand anyway. So either you change the standard or you go into your ordinance and you add a provision to your non-conforming use section that allows for you to do some things differently with non-conformities. I mean, there's a couple of different ways to get at it, but I think where you have to decide first is what your mindset is. Do you support your standard or not? Because if you don't, then you should change it.
Well, I think
But
in the zoning, what we see a lot is you have a lot of old houses out there that were built before, that were built before the zoning rules went into effect, and I think out here is 1976, correct? And you see a lot of old houses there, so, and there's a lot of small lots, 33-foot lots or something, and somebody maybe 4 feet from the property line building a home. Well, they want to rebuild a home. And you know, a lot of the old cottages aren't in very good shape, so they want to rebuild a home and put it on the same footprint. And in your interpretation, that would be something that shouldn't be allowed. And we've always taken the tack up for years, you're allowed to build on your own footprint. I mean, in my opinion, I've been living on a lake for a long time, and if you start going down that road, that you're not gonna allow something to be rebuilt because the zoning says this is what you eventually have to come back to. That's taking the property. When somebody's spending, you know, $300,000, $400,000 for a lot out on a lake, we're not talking about a 1 acre parcel in the middle of the country. You know, lakes a little different animal.
yes, so let's add, I'm gonna clarify a couple of things. So number one, you certainly can have a provision in your ordinance under your non-conforming that establishes that practice. So if the township says, you know what, we want to be able to allow for the reconstruction of a non-conforming building. Hello?
Are you there?
You know, I lost my,
We got you.
oh, you can see me?
Mhm.
Well, this is kind of crazy. My screen just went totally black, but I'll just keep talking. I can do that. So yeah, if you want, if that's a practice that you want to be able to allow is for the reconstruction of a non-conforming building. And whatever is non-conforming about that building, in your example, the non-conformity was the setbacks. And so you can have a provision in your ordinance that says that. If you don't have a provision in your ordinance that says that, then they cannot do that, because your non-conforming use provisions say that you can't reestablish a non-conformity unless it is in conformance with the ordinance, i.e. unless it complies with the setback standards. So number one.
And that's, Becky, this is Carol, that is exactly what our ordinance says. It says if you rebuild, you have to comply with the new standard, you have to comply with the standards.
Yeah, every ordinance says that. I mean, every once in a while, you'll get an ordinance where a community has gone in and said, you know, we're going to let them rebuild these. Especially, I've seen ordinances that limit it to single family homes, where they'll say if it's a single. But you know, honestly, it's kind of counterintuitive to do that, because the whole idea behind nonconformity is that you will eventually get conformity. And so if you always allow something to be reconstructed out of conformance, then you're never going to have conformity. And I would say that would argue, you know, if you guys look at that and say that's not what we like, then I would say, yeah, then I would say you're probably not satisfied with your setback requirements. But let me add another point of clarification. Not allowing the reconstruction of a nonconformity just by right is not the taking of property. That is not the same thing as if you've got a lot that is a lawfully non-conforming lot. I think in your scenario you said it's a lot that predates the ordinance, so it's substandard in size, substandard in the sense that it doesn't meet the standards. So you've got a lot that's narrow and that is small. You are absolutely correct. That is a lawfully non-conforming lot, which means it's buildable. And it means that they don't have to come in and get special approval in order to propose to use the property for a permitted use. However, the use of that property does have to be in accordance with the ordinance. So what happens on these, and I know I'm telling you the thing you already know, but I'm just laying the groundwork for our conversation. If you have a substandard size lot, you're absolutely right. Whether there was a non-conforming structure on there or not, if it's narrow and small, the chances are that the building envelope on that lot is so small that it takes away any reasonable use of the property. And what that means then is that it puts the property owner in the position of having to seek a variance in order just to use the property. Not a variance from the lot size or lot width, but a variance from whatever dimensional requirement they need in order to make that building envelope big enough that they can fit what they want to do on it. That's why one approach to that is what some communities will do, especially communities that have lake property, waterfront properties. If it's a lake community, usually the waterfront properties are all substandard in size. They were split, you know, before the zoning ordinance. And they're all confronted with the same position of the cottages are being replaced with year-round homes. And everything is, you know, the properties are too small to accommodate the size homes that they want to put on, but without variances. So one of the things that one approach a community will use is a sliding scale approach, where it doesn't remove all all needs to get a variance. Sometimes it's still not enough, and you know, if the property is extremely small, it might not give you enough relief. But it's an approach that removes the variance process for you, where it allows for a reduction in the dimensional standard proportionate to the nonconformity of the lot. So for instance, if your lot is you know, let's say you have 100-foot width requirement for your lot size, and but your lot is only 50 feet wide, then it allows for a reduction in the side setback requirements proportionate to that amount of nonconformity in the width standard, right? It shifts that down a little bit in proportion, but it does it to every nonconforming lot. So no one is being treated differently. They're all being treated the same. And it provides enough relief that you really reduce the need for a variance. Without something like that, it is true that you're essentially putting everyone in a position that they have to come get a variance, number one. Number two, you're putting the ZBA in a position of having to grant the variance, because to your point, you're right, you can't, one of the criteria for a variance, right, is are there reasonable options to comply? And in many of these cases, you're going to have to say, well, without a variance, there is no building envelope to use. And so it puts the ZBA in a position of having to grant relief. And that's not a good place to be either. And so it's a better practice to provide the relief outside of the variance process, so that you're not putting the ZBA in a position of having to grant variances when they might not necessarily meet the variance criteria, but they're having to do it because they have no choice. So that's never ideal. So you know, there's a lot of that's a way of dealing with substandard sized lots. Another way of if you have it really depends on the metrics that you're dealing with, and you know this hugely better than I do, but whatever your metric problems are, or limitations or situations around these lake lots, another approach is to reassess what it is you think the appropriate lot size and lot width standard is for your lakefront property. If you've got 50 lots, I'm making all this up, but if you've got 50 waterfront lots, and then you have a standard over, and they're all in this one zoning district, and then you have a zoning standard over here where only 5 of the lots meet your zoning standard, and the rest of them are all smaller and narrower than your standard, then I think a more likely assessment might be that your standards are perhaps are off. And so another way around it, rather than the sliding scale approach, although you could do that too, is to take a look and think through and essentially confirm that your dimensional requirements for your district are where you want them to be. And quite frankly, where the master plan envisions them to be. I mean, that's kind of dictated by your master plan. So I totally understand that on lake lots, you know, if they are non-conforming, even though they're lawfully non-conforming and you can build on them, if your standards are such that it's not going to let anyone use, you know, do anything on the property without variances, then I think it's almost better to take a step back and kind of come in from a bigger picture standpoint and say, okay, what is it that we want on these waterfront properties? Because honestly, if most of them are all existing, then they're probably, and I don't know that they are, I probably shouldn't have assumed that. If they are, then,
You're gonna
you know,
say
what are
95% are not
95?
at least.
Yeah, so I mean, that's, and would you say that 95% of them are significantly, because right now your,
Yeah.
lot size is 1 acre, right?
Are 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet from the property line,
1 foot.
1 foot, some are even their neighbors.
Well,
But
I'm talking about, lot sizes. What do you think the average lot
Lot
size
size
is?
is very non-conforming.
But I think some of this, where this came from, it wasn't so much about shrinking a new lot size, to make it smaller. It's trying to let people with an existing situation improve their property. So I don't think it's like making the lot smaller for a brand new lot, new construction. I think we're pretty happy with those setbacks. But if somebody has an existing house and it's a shack and they want to improve it, that's really where I think this initiative came from. In almost every case, you got 3 or 4 letters from each neighbor saying, we hope they do it. This is great. This is a shack. Improve it, but their existing house requires setbacks on 3 sides to even put it in the footprint. So how do you let somebody like that improve their house without a huge expense and huge time? Because I think it's what, $700 for a ZBA meeting, and probably 2 months minimum usually from start to finish of the process.
Well,
Differentiate that. I mean, I think there's trying to say is if somebody's trying to improve their house on an existing footprint, even if it's not conforming, I think we'd like to try to let them do that. But on the converse side, you don't want somebody, or maybe they got a 3 acre lake lot. I don't even know if we have one in the township. And they want to cut out a postage stamp and sell it to their son or daughter and squeeze a house in and, you know, pinch off their neighbor because we're allowing a small setback. I think it's a difference from a new lot versus an existing lot. That's what I'm trying to say.
so that's a great platform to have this conversation, because my question to you would be, if you think it's okay for the existing home to be 5 feet off the property line, if the only reason, and if you think the reason that's okay is because the home's already there, but you don't think it's okay for a new home to be 5 feet off the property line, which is essentially, I made the numbers up, but that's kind of what you're saying, is that, well, if it's there, then the encroachment doesn't really bother us because we want them to be able to improve their property. But you take out that last part, because we want them to improve the property, because that isn't, you don't have the luxury of thinking that way. The question is, what is the appropriate separation between building and between property lines? You know, it's between buildings and so therefore property lines. So if you're thinking the appropriate separation between buildings is 10 feet, then you're going to have a sideline setback of 5 feet, let's say. And you're saying, we think that's what's necessary to maintain safety and appropriate building separation and appropriate access and whatever it is, you know, you've concluded. Then you have to look at the new property, let's say the undeveloped property. Let's say you have a lot there and they haven't built anything on it. And they're still only allowed to put 1 home on it. That's all they're allowed to do. So if you're thinking 5 foot from the property line is okay for this house, then it has to be okay for the other house too.
But what if something's not a lot of record? Where the existing house is, nothing's on, it's not a lot of record, somebody's splitting something off. I think you look at it a little bit differently. When somebody has an existing home as opposed to a piece of property, and they want to make that existing blank piece of property less conforming, I think there's a huge difference. I mean, you're the expert on this, but in my opinion, I think if you have a home existing, that's treated differently than if you have a blank piece of property with no house, no existing house on it.
So don't, yeah, I understand what you're saying. But what you want to make sure you do is make sure you're not don't mix up the idea of splitting the property with the setback requirement. So you're right. We're not talking about making the lot sizes smaller so that this person can then create smaller lots. We're not talking about changing the lot size standard at all right now. I'm just talking about the side setback requirement as an example. Is that because you having the same side setback standard for all lots does not give the owner of the undeveloped large acreage any more opportunity to split his land. Because that has nothing to do with the side setback. So if you decide that if you feel like on these buildings that are existing, let's forget about whether the lots are what the size of the lots. We'll forget about that. We're talking about the non-conforming buildings. And if you feel like a lot of the non-conforming buildings that are on these waterfront lots are, I'm using 5 feet. So let's say that's the right number. And yet your standard is 10 feet. Then rather than trying to, I'm trying to think of the way to sort of help you envision this. So if the township says we think the appropriate standard is 10 feet, and if you go in and build new, we're gonna make you stay back 10 feet from your side property line. But then you turn to the existing home and they're gonna put an addition on and you say, well, it's okay for you to be 5 feet because your house was already there. See, those two things are unrelated. It might be the reason they want 5 feet is because, you know, that makes sense because of where their house is, but it doesn't make sense that you require one person 5 and the other person 10. It suggests that you don't have a reason for your side setback. You know, maybe you're not married to the 10 foot. Because if you're thinking it's okay to do 5 on a whole bunch of the property, but on these other newer properties, they have to be 10. I would suggest, and because it's got nothing to do with lot divisions, that's all dictated by lot size standards. So if you're talking about setbacks, we just happen to be talking about the side setbacks, but it would apply to any of your setback standards, rear, front, or side, is that if all properties are going to be in the same district, then you have to treat properties in the same district the same. If you're feeling like you don't want to because of, you know, circumstances, that's a good test for you to sort of take a step back and say, huh, if I want to treat properties in the same district differently, then maybe my standard isn't, maybe the purpose of my standard needs a rethink. Because you have to treat properties the same. All I was saying on the, I think that if we're talking about kind of moving into the Lake Residential District conversation, I think waterfront properties are difficult for communities. So not that you need to feel better about it, but I just didn't want you to think you were the only one struggling with this. Because for one thing, I think dealing with nonconformities can be confusing because you're dealing with a number of nonconformities. You're dealing with the lot themselves being nonconforming. which is posing a certain set of problems. And then you're dealing with buildings on those non-conforming lots being non-conforming. And then that adds, right, a whole nother couple of problems for you. And so that's why, rather than trying to deal with each of those things as a variance, that's what makes it such a struggle, is because, as you know, the variance process is intended to provide relief to properties that are experiencing some unique situation. Which clearly, all of the things we've been talking about are not unique. They are things that are apparent on many of the lots. And that's when a community, you guys are doing the exact right thing by having this conversation, because if that's the case, if the circumstances and the problems are the same problems occurring on a lot of the properties, then the variance process is not the right way to provide that relief, because the answer's always got to be no, because there's no unique circumstance. It's just a bunch of nonconformities. And so instead, what you do, which is exactly what you're doing, is you look at it and you say, you know what, we're going to remove the need for a variance by creating a set of standards that can be met. And then that way, at least for the majority of them, and then that way, there may very well be someone who still needs a variance, but it may very well be a more legitimate variance, something that is taking into consideration some unique circumstance of their property. Maybe there's a severe grade change or something like that, that they can really say, look, this isn't happening on other properties. And by doing that, you really have, you have a lot of things you can consider modifying to make these existing lots and these existing buildings, sort of be able to meet your standards more easily. And I think you do that through a combination of a sliding scale approach, through providing some provisions in your non-conforming section that allow for I was telling Carol, what some communities have done is they will allow for they deal with non-conformities, expansions of non-conformities. They'll deal with those a little bit differently as like special land uses, so that the planning commission can sort of consider them on an impact basis rather than shipping them over to the ZBA, where the ZBA's hands are tied. They pretty much can only consider the variance criteria. They can't consider anything else. And so, I think there are some options for that, but the key is knowing exactly what it is you think I can tell you how to do it, but you have to tell me what it is you want. And if you're feeling like, you think the side setbacks need to be modified, or, what have you, I can tell you great ways to address some of your non-conforming hurdles that are being laid in front of you. Do you have problems on these waterfront lots on anything besides the side setbacks?
Lar, sides of lots, sides of frontage, setbacks in all directions.
The ratio.
You got a lot of 33, 40-foot lots. To build a reasonable structure on that, and you can't expect people to have a 10-foot wide house.
So it's mostly the side setbacks that they have different. Pardon me?
Florida area ratio, lot coverage, I'm sorry, go ahead, Steve, you were saying, I was typing when you were talking. So, go ahead with the rest of it, Florida area ratio, lot coverage, front yard setback, actually,
Side yard setbacks.
side yard setbacks is one of them, but
When we do variance for houses, it's typically somebody's asking for between 4 and 5 variances.
yeah, there are usually about 4 and 5 variances that they're asking for. Because they're all old platted lots. And there's
Yeah.
a few that are combined, but there's a lot that are 30, I mean, there's a lot of them that are 33 foot wide. No way could they make a 20 foot side yard setback. They're like within reaching distance to their neighbor.
But it's
To-
setbacks.
What do you guys think about your 20 foot? Do you have a sense that 20 foot is excessive?
I don't think 20 foot is even close to 90% of the houses that are built out here. So 20
Well, let's say that there weren't any homes. Do you think 20 foot is a reasonable setback standard?
Lake area, no.
No, I mean, how many houses got a 20 foot setback out there? Not many.
5%.
Probably. Yep. I mean, most of the houses that we're dealing with have, 4 to 10 foot setbacks.
Because 20 foot for an area of that density, a 20 foot setback standard for a side is really high.
And that got adopted, I believe, when they went to a 1 acre requirement. And the 1 acre requirement was for well and septic, and now there's sewers. So that all changed way back when they were starting to have problems. They have sewers. The 1 acre is not as significant because the health department, it's a different standard now.
Right.
Are we?
Yeah, 20 foot, even if you didn't, I know you guys, I think you said that a lot of the places are like less than 5 feet, right? But even if you change, a typical side setback standard for that density of development is usually 5 to 10 feet. So even if that's obviously one thing that you could do is to change your side setback standard for waterfront properties. And, let's say for a district that is going to be applied around that, like whatever district that is, or you can put them in a new district. If the R1 district is elsewhere in the township and you don't want to change it, I know that's what you wanted me to look at, was the idea of creating a lake residential district where you could really set the standards however you felt could be supported by the master plan. But that's certainly one thing to do, is to take a look at reducing some of those to be more not in line with what is existing, but more in line with what it is you think is appropriate for that district. And what that would do, there's a chance that would improve the circumstances for some of those properties. If you reduced it to 10 foot is a very basic side setback standard, at least for principal buildings. Sometimes they let the accessory buildings be less than that. But even if you reduced it to 10, that's one approach. You might find that improves circumstances for some of the properties.
I didn't think the purpose of this meeting was to discuss and get in the weeds and what we want to put it on the zoning ordinance. Is that true or not? Like, talk about what setbacks or appropriate things like that this time? I thought this is more an overview kind of meeting.
You didn't hear Steve?
No.
I said, I thought the purpose of this meeting was more of an overview. I didn't think we are gonna be getting in the weeds as to what the setbacks are and things like that.
Well, so, what I was wanting to use the meeting for, although I'm happy to do it however you want to do it. So I understand there are 3 areas of amendments that the township would like to have me put together. One had to do with your administrative site plan review process. One is the establishment or creation of a lake residential district. And one is language to regulate solar energy facilities. My feeling was that in order to do that for you, I wanted to get your feelings, your opinions about what some of your concerns were about those 3 things, about why you might be looking at doing each of those 3 things, that because for me to know what it is you're trying to achieve or what some of your struggles are now, then I know how to draft the language so that they in fact address both of those things. Now you're right. We started with the ASPR. I think I understand what it is you're looking for there. And I think we just sort of segued into the Lake Residential District. But from my perspective, having that conversation was helpful because like I said, I had spoken to Kathy and Carol, so I knew what some of your some of the things that's triggering your interest, what it is you're trying to solve. But that was helpful for me to hear you. I mean, it's so much easier rather than me just drafting something and providing it to you and then you saying, well, that's not our problem. I mean, I didn't want to waste your time that way. So this conversation for me with you was an opportunity to get your feedback and reaction to what it is you're attempting, what it is you'd like to see. Now, I don't know if you had more things you wanted to tell me about the Lake Residential District. If you don't, if you feel like you've shared with me what your concerns are and what it is you're trying to achieve, then I would, the last item were the solar energy facilities. And once again, so I wouldn't say this is an overview because I haven't drafted anything. It's my opportunity to ask you questions and to answer questions if you had any. So if you wanted to, we could sort of move into the solar energy facilities, because before I started work on that, I wanted to ask you some things as well. So are you wanting to talk about that, or did you want to talk more about the lake residential?
I'm gonna say one more thing on the ZBA and the lake stuff. We've been consistent since we have not had an LR district. The ZBA has kind of been consistently enforcing the variances that we have. One is if you're already within the setback, you're not getting any closer. Okay. We don't allow people to get any closer. We do allow people to go 50% higher on the FAR and LAR because the low density residential is not really applicable to lake residential. Because you're talking about a 1 acre place in the country as opposed to a 1/3 of an acre on a $400,000 lot. So we've been very consistent in what we've done and enforced. I've been on the ZBA for about 14 years. Some others have a lot of experience here, and we have been very, very, very consistent. So it was our way of trying to have a lake residential ordinance without having one, by providing consistent guidance and approval to everybody that comes in front of us.
Yeah, I think you're on the right path with your reasoning. If the ZBA has been consistent in how they're granting variances, then the appropriate next step is that the ordinance should, for instance, if you're saying that it is your practice that when you're presented with a certain circumstance, the ZBA always acts in this one way to grant, what'd you say, 50% or something like that, then the appropriate, if that's done over and over again, the appropriate next step would be for that simply to be established in the ordinance. Because variances are supposed to be unusual. You don't grant them very often. And so I think what the ZBA is doing is they're doing a great job of being able to share with the planning commission a consistency of circumstance. And then that allows the planning commission to say, oh, if this circumstance seems to be present within most of these properties, then it is better to establish the standard by right, if you will, automatically, rather than to have the standard applied through a variance. So the ZBA has essentially done the work for the planning commission then, in terms of saying, here is the frequent problem and here is our frequent solution. So I think that would actually be a valuable thing for the planning commission to know.
Okay, thank you. So just, that's the time of point getting moving on here. Just one question on this, based on what we've heard about the administrative site plan. Is it really gonna be the most powerful? That's a good point. It sounds like from a site plan perspective, we don't need that many in this part.
But like she said, if we get one, I mean, we've had several, St. Louis School's been one. We've had a couple, trying to think who else has come in, where they had to modify something minimal on their site plan. And I have to make them pay, come back to you to get approval.
Even though St. Louis had the papers.
They did not, they say disaster extensions.
Right.
So on when they did it, reviews, when they had a modification, yeah, they had to come back and pay.
Okay. I was just trying to figure out the value add of putting this ordinance in based upon the demand, but it sounds like from your perspective, Carol, this is a useful ordinance.
Even if we had to, on a couple, we've had several,
Okay.
And some of these administrative review process for site plan review, we make them pay $900 application fee and a $2,500, professional services review fee to get an okey-doke. That's pretty stiff, and 2 months.
Okay. Any other comments on that?
I would just say the definitions are gonna be important, I think, defining what a minor change is. And then defining what materially affects the intensity of the use, because that's where your arguments are gonna be. And that's where any litigation is gonna go in. So I think just making sure those standards are clearly defined, whether it's a particular definition we work in, or if you use a plain language definition, I think that's important.
Thanks. Are we ready to move on to solar energy systems? All right. Becky, you want to start off?
So on your solar energies, are you getting a lot of interest in your community to establish solar facilities, either individually or utility scale?
So I will answer that. I got quite a bit of interest on residential. And we have had inquiries about utility grade use, but we don't have an ordinance, so there was nothing to allow anybody to apply for. We've kind of been somewhat, people have been critical that we didn't allow it, or that they came and were turned down. Well, they they were turned down because we don't have an ordinance to address it, so. It wasn't as if I could even bring it before the planning commission because there was nothing to allow for it.
Alright, so on the individual solar energy facilities. What is the planning commission's position about that? Are you do you want to allow it? Do you want to encourage it? Do you have concerns about people doing it, or do you feel like it's something that you really don't want to have, you know, you don't want to be too heavy-handed about, or do you actually have some concerns? And I'm talking about just the individual properties, like residential or commercial, someone who wants to have solar panels on their home or what have you. What's your overall position on that?
My personal view is on a roof, and that I think that's, you know, I don't have any particular problem here. I think it's where you get into concerns. You've got it along fence lines or areas that block people's views or intrude on someone else. Where one area we need to look at. That would be from a residential perspective, that would be one. And then the other question is, a lot of these are, they're gonna need to have these battery storage, right? And I don't know what sort of environmental risk they bring along with that. We need to be concerned about that also, the lithium, things of that nature. So there's the chemical aspect of it also. I mean, most residents aren't going to necessarily have the capability to understand they got a lithium leak and it's got some sort of environmental hazards to their property. Those things I don't know, they're kind of be concerned about.
Could you hear that, Becky?
I heard most of it. I didn't hear the very last thing.
About the chemical part of it?
Yeah, I heard everything but right that your last sentence.
I think that's good enough to go.
Okay, okay.
Courtney, you got any comments on your side? Making this farm side, right?
Yeah, from the farm side, I know people in other townships that have put large solar systems locally in place to provide themselves with energy for whatever use, whether it's for water to be not frozen for the livestock or if it's for their entire farm. So I think it's something we need to look at, and see what we'd allow for acreage and also how that works on fence lines and, like you said, obscuring a neighbor's view or things along those lines. But how big of a system based on the household or the business or whatever, that's what is important as well.
Yeah, then the districts, I know it's on your list, but one thing I don't see on here is any discussion about wind. Is that something that we need to consider also? You know, just throwing that out there. I mean, I'm not a big fan of propellers sticking up in the sky, right?
Well, one of the things that our attorney asked us to do was look at both of them because, well, we have consumers right here already that has, and they are looking at alternative ways to generate electricity. So I think we need to look at wind as well.
They're put one tall, big tower up, they're gonna get more than one. Right. It's not cost effective if you don't do more than one. To do the cleaning and stuff, etc.
Tom, can you speak into the microphone, please?
In order to make it feasible, you're gonna have more than just one. You're gonna have a bunch of them. If you're going to the big commercial ones.
And I think they're talking about wind.
Yeah, so, Carol, is that something that you think the the township board, or I guess the township, were they wanting the wind energy facilities as part of this project as well?
That wasn't my understanding. I thought we were just doing solar, but if the board, I mean, that Sandy can take that back to the board and ask for clarification.
Sure.
You know,
Okay,
that would be her job to do, so.
okay, okay.
A whole different ballgame. I dealt with that at consumers. I would keep it separate from solar, because you have all kinds of litigation issues, you have shadow, you have noise, you have
So
all
we're
kinds of
looking,
health issues that people complain on that, so that is a very sticky thing to get into.
so we're just gonna look at solar residential
Or at least right now,
or,
Right now,
or keep them separate. Even if we look at them all, they need to be separate.
But the question, if we open up solar, does that imply wind, and can someone take the court on that too? That's, I don't know that.
I should think it's something we should look into. Because at one time, 5, 8 years ago, they were talking about doing something out to the proving grounds. In Reuben, they were talking about putting a test one out there at Reuben's at one time, and then all of a sudden that just sort of fell by the wayside.
Okay.
So my understanding of this was, we were looking at whether the planning commission thought that there was an opportunity for utility grade and residential. You know, there would be two components, but it wasn't going to be just doing residential right now and then going back. I think the idea that the board was looking at is, does the planning commission think that there is an opportunity? And if there is for solar fields in utility grade, where would you want them?
I swear that Kurt told me that there's maps somewhere that maybe, and it must be for wind, that because there's gonna be particular places in the community that's gonna be right for wind. And it's already been looked at. And so they're not gonna come to my house because I'm not on a hill and I don't, you know, I'm not in a position to capture wind to make energy. Maybe if we could find that out. I mean, I think it's like not, it's a mystery to us, but it's not a mystery to people who wanna do that. They're going to come and ask about properties that, you know, face prevailing wind. I don't know, I don't know anything about it. It's just that,
Well, isn't one option to prohibit commercial solar farms? Isn't that one of the options you can consider? When I look at what most of the residents in this township seem to be concerned about, the most vocal ones are about bringing in high density development, big developments. And solar wind farms are very controversial. They have a lot of negative impacts. And for one, I don't believe we're in a good wind area because most, the energy companies are already siting their solar farms in places in the state that they've had good wind.
Right.
So I don't think we're in a great area for wind here, so we're somewhat insulated from that, but maybe that's one of the options to say we prohibit commercial solar farms in Sullivan Township. I think most residents would support that. And conversely, when it comes to solar, I think most residents would like to see people be able to put solar power on their roof, generate their own personal electricity. But do they want to have a 300-acre solar farm? There's one out in Grass Lake getting developed right now on Francisco and Michigan Ave. Take a ride out and look at it. I wouldn't want to live next to it.
I personally don't have anything against solar arrays. The person who owns the property where the solar array is built is the one who gets money from it. And I really feel bad to say, I don't want to look at that because that denies somebody being able to make additional money from their property.
So on the individual solar panels, whether, you know, where you have the panels on your building or on your property and they're strictly providing electricity to that property. Do you have would you like to see standards that have a lot of parameters for, you know, that there are regulations for them, or is your mindset to be a little less regulatory on the individual? I work for a lot of communities that are like, man, they go all through that spectrum, and some communities are like, nope, they're accessory, and as long as they meet the setbacks, they're fine, blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, the other community is like, no, they have very particular standards that they want. even the individual to follow. I was trying to get a feel for what you guys, what's your take on that?
I'd like a little clarification on who is in charge of inspecting or whatever, if we are really prescriptive, who's in charge of making sure that the parameters are being met? And do we even have that person employed or what have you?
Did you hear that?
Who would be in charge of confirming compliance essentially?
Yes.
Well, I mean, it is considered, well, we haven't written it yet, but let's assume that we consider it an accessory structure. It would be inspected by, your building inspector and your zoning administrator, just like any other building or structure in that's regulated by the zoning ordinance.
That means Carol will get her own ladder.
Everybody put on one. There's liability.
Maybe the best way to handle it, I could give us examples of both, and people can look at it and get some feedback.
Oh, okay.
That's probably a good place to start, right? I'm sure there's no ground between the two extremes, right?
Yeah, what I can do is I'll put it together with all of the options, and then as you go through that, if there's elements of that where you say, well, that seems too restrictive, we can just pull it out then. But yeah, you're right. That way you can kind of see how that would read.
Then the other question is, I think Sam brought up is, we got for the commercial, you do have the property rights of the owner, right? It has to be considered in conjunction with the surrounding neighborhoods. I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer for how I want to handle that, but maybe we could talk about it, right?
Well, I was sure you could have something in front of my house, not over on Francisco.
Yeah. So I don't know if you've got any, maybe just for review, if you've got kind of for industrial, what those would look like. The harsh case and the least harsh case, maybe something to look at. Yeah. Probably a reasonable approach.
Have you worked with any communities that have adjusted their approach? Maybe they started really prescriptive and then reassessed and backed off, or vice versa? And what led to making those adjustments?
Only one. It was a community that had, and every community's kind of got their personality, but this particular community had taken a relatively middle of the road approach to, and I'm speaking now of the individual on-site facilities. And they had taken a, for instance, the solar panels had to be either in the side or the rear yard, unless they allowed a front yard location as a special land use. That's the approach they used, because they said, generally speaking, we don't want a Siemens front yard, but understanding that on some properties, maybe the front yard is the best location in order to let this work. And so rather than just, discarding that out of hand, we'll do it as a special land use. And if they can demonstrate to us that that's the prime location, blah, 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 they have their parameters. So, for them, it was very middle of the road, but they still had, they wanted to be involved in that decision making. And they only had the very first person who applied for it. And it was a rather mundane solar array too. I mean, some solar arrays can be, even though it's for a home, can be maybe 10 panels. And this was just a very small array. It was like maybe 4 panels. And the planning, they needed it in the front yard, so they went to the special land, but they actually required landscaping. A lot more than what a lot of communities do. And the neighbors in the area had a fit, and they caused so much trouble over it that the township board directed the planning commission to remove the front yard number one, to no longer allow freestanding. They now only allow panels if they are on the building. That is the only community that I have seen, that I work with, and I work with about 16 or 17 of them, that I'm aware of, that went in and kind of rethought some of their standards, and in this case made them more restrictive. What I do find it, I was telling Carol this too, I found it's been really interesting because some communities I work with are very, they're very, look, these are, they're accessory, they treat them much like they would, an air conditioner or a generator or something, right? Where they say, well, you have to meet the setbacks and you have to do this, that, and the other thing. But other than that, they don't require additional reviews, they don't. And that's just kind of their position on it. And the very next community feels much differently. And it's been very educational for me to see the different concerns, the different perspectives, and good ways of dealing with those, right? So I've been exposed to a lot of different ideas and ways of kind of responding to that. So it's been interesting. I would say on your, so the individuals, they refer to them as accessory solar energy systems because they are not considered the principal use, right? The principal use is the home or the business. And so having the panel that is simply serving, or the system that is simply serving that building or that property, they're considered accessory. Then what they do, well, and you'll see this in my outline, but then those that are not accessory, so I think we always just call them solar farms, but what they're referring to them as are as principal use solar energy systems. But what I thought was an interesting distinction that a lot of communities are making is they'll have one which is a small principal use and then a large principal use. And so then they actually put on as a small solar farm, for instance, is that it's a solar farm that you put an acreage size on that's maybe only 10 or 20 acres in size. And apparently those are getting quite a bit of support from communities because, kind of to your comment about providing the opportunity for someone to generate an income, to create the electricity without going with the 500 acre facility, which a lot of communities are not supportive of that. So they kind of allow the small, but maybe not the large. Or they allow the small as permitted, and then the large they only allow as a special use, and then they might have a maximum acreage on it. So there are some ways to deal with that. What I would say is that if the township, whichever way the township thinks they want to go, whether they want to provide for it or not provide for it, it will be key that you support that in your master plan. I understand you guys are going through a master plan update, so you will want to make sure that your planner knows to speak to that in your master plan. And depending on whatever your position is, that should lay that foundation. Because if you're suggesting that you might want to support some of these principal use systems, at least at some scale, then the master plan should sort of make that finding, and it should also identify those areas in the community where it would be appropriate. And that all happens in the plan, and then we can make sure that that ordinance is tailored around that foundational premise. Now I can go ahead and I might just put together some language for you anyway, and then you'll have it. and then you can sync it up to your master plan amendment too. But you can see what that would look like, but I wanted to make sure I said that so that you did that.
Oh, Rob, is maybe the question is, if we go ahead with the solar ordinance for residential, but we say we don't want commercial scale, does that put us any sort of risk? For lawsuits down the road, you only have it halfway.
Not allowing the principal use solar systems.
So say you allow for residential and not large scale commercial. Does that open the township up to any unique risk?
Well, if you're allowing the individual sites, but not the large scale, as long as you have it supported in your master plan, it does not. Your master plan does have to speak to why it is you're not supporting it. I mean, it would have to provide those findings, for instance, that, maybe you had no areas that were conducive to it, right? Like where they weren't near the infrastructure they needed or what have you. And there are some communities too who don't allow it on prime farm, and I think that's been in enough ordinances where that would be supportable. So if in your master plan you did an assessment where you said, look, we only have certain areas that are where it could even be supported, and those happen to be prime farmland soils. I'm just saying that as an example. That would be the premise that your master plan could lay out clearly. And that would provide the support for the township saying, so therefore we're not going to allow those.
So, but if we do that, then we have to survey the township and determine where there might, or as he was saying, not be areas conducive to. Sorry.
There you go
You
with taking again. What happens if I have 150 acres and I want to, but the township says no, that 150 acres is just too valuable to farm.
I think she was saying that if. I don't know. Go ahead.
I'm just asking that question. And what happens if they put 150 acre of these panels up? 20 years down the road, they're no good. Now we have 150 acres with solar panels that aren't doing nothing. And is that what the people are gonna look at the rest of their lives?
No,
Or is there a bond to where they're gonna clean it
Yes.
up?
Yes.
Yeah,
Just before they go out of business?
Yeah.
Well, I think Sandy's question is how do you define prime farm?
Well,
There is no other question. The only place it is the thumb.
Yeah, but the idea is that
It's still.
you made a classification for land and how do you distinguish one from the other?
right.
I'm just trying to figure out how you, so I have 150 acres of prime farm ground and I said, man, it's getting to where I can't afford to make a buck here. If these people are gonna come in and say, they're gonna give me so much money to put this on, and I can keep 50 acres and someone's gonna help pay my taxes and stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean,
That's my only question is how do you dictate whose property is valuable and whose isn't?
does that make sense, Rebecca, the conversation?
It's
yeah. As one point of explanation, your principal use or your large scale utility grid systems. In the ordinance, there is a requirement for a decommissioning plan. Much like, like a landfill or anything else where they require reclamation and they refer to it as decommissioning, but that speaks to your one concern, because I think that's a totally legitimate one in terms of, because they say they have a life of about 30 to 40 years. And so it is the question then, right? And then what? So fair question. So that would be a part of the ordinance. So what I was trying to do is so you're going through this master plan update And there's two ways to look at this. One way would be to tell your planner who's doing the update, look, we're attempting to assess whether or not we have lands in this township that are appropriate for principal use systems, otherwise the large scale systems. And there are some things that these systems need, you know, they have to be a certain distance to these major, to this infrastructure. So, I mean, it's not just random in that respect. So your, that particular planning process is going to provide the township with a certain level of information as to whether or not, you know, your township is ripe for these kinds of uses. Then that exercise gives you the cover to make the next decision, which is an answer to your question. What about the guy who wants to use the land, blah, 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 right? Then you decide whether or not you want to allow for them and how. Now, I think if you have lands available, if you have the infrastructure and you have some pretty noticeable areas that would be of interest for it, you might find it difficult to take the position of, well, we're not going to allow them. That's going to be tough. However, what I was trying to share is, let's say that you do have areas of the township that seem like it could support it. Then the planning commission and the township get to decide, okay, so we think we have to allow it because we have reasonable lands available, but you have the choice to allow it to whatever degree you want. And so I was trying to give you some angles you could use. So if your position is, we want a whole bunch of them here, well, then you would craft it this way. If you're saying that, no, we really don't, we don't mind some, but then you can start looking at some parameters to put on it that help you sort of confine. And one of the things that they recommend as a way for a community, if they are a community that have prime farmland soils as defined by the Department of Ag, and you'd put what that definition you're using, that you can say in your ordinance as an example, those lands that meet that definition are not going to be, we're not going to allow them on those lands. Now, you also don't have to say that. If you don't want any of those kinds of parameters, you don't have to. I was just saying there are different ways of doing it.
Okay. Lots of interesting conversation. Does anyone else got questions or comments for Rebecca? Steve? Rod, any comments from your side? No. Patrick, how about you? You got something to say?
Yeah, actually, I know quite a bit about solar. I'd like to put them on roofs too, if possible, because it doesn't take up land, but sometimes that's not possible. What I did want to share, and I would share this with a comment if I had gotten enough time, is that utility companies have classifications for solar power systems in different regulatory classes. They have one that is specifically meant for accessory use for residential. The lowest class, it goes up to 20 kilowatts. That's just a sizing parameter. And it may be sufficient that for those accessory use solar, which is like your regular residential, perhaps the Public Service Commission, who creates those rules, already has sufficient regulations in place. In that case, what you'd really be looking at, I think, is the primary use, the big commercial one, where you really have to consider land use. and look at the law. I'm familiar with all kinds of different situations, but sometimes you have to put it on roofs because you want to do the south facing roof. Sometimes you don't have a south facing roof, if you have trees over here, or you have something over there. I don't know, I heard something about, people needing accessory structures in their front yard because their lake lots are small. What's the difference between a shed and a small solar array? Really? Just what people like looking at. Right? Oh, and batteries. The batteries in an electric car are typically about 3 times as big as the battery system you have in your home. So considering liquid leaking, cars are the bigger issue. I'm in favor of electric stuff in general, but I'm just saying, technically that's really a bigger issue.
All right, well, thanks, Patrick. Call for adjournment. So move.
Yeah, I had one more question if I could interrupt. Do you have a preference on the order in which I proceed of getting language drafted for you on these 3 topics?
Probably solar first.
Solar first?
Would be my.
The group.
I think.
And do you have a particular schedule? Would you like just broad brush? Are you are you ready to start getting draft text and that kind of thing?
What's your calendar look like? Maybe that's.
Yeah, I can, so as far as I'm concerned, I can get you draft 1 of your solar text for your February meeting, if you would like it that soon. I didn't know if your February meeting was full already, or so you tell me, but I can do that.
Yeah, it doesn't sound unreasonable, so.
Okay. Thank you.
I think Steve thinks the lake residential should go earlier.
No.
I think we need to talk about that.
The point I was gonna say about the lake residential, I think that we need to go a little bit deeper in the weeds and talk about setbacks and other stuff and what we've been doing.
Yes.
Obviously, it's gonna be public hearings after this, so it's just like a first draft anyway.
I think the lake's gonna be a can of worms.
It's gonna be a can. Yeah,
Not gonna be.
no. Not at all.
But not addressing it doesn't help solve.
No. And honestly, I'm not sure you can address it, to be honest. From what I've seen with them, it's hard.
It's very.
Once said, we had this conversation a long time ago, Pat says, just keep the same way so you know what's going on.
Yeah.
Because people say one thing and their plat plan says another thing and they change it. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, the current process does somewhat work. Most people get to improve their properties. They get a variance for what they need. But like Steve said, it's consistent and we try to keep it from going way over. Like blocking other people's views, encroaching in, and now your neighbor can't see the lake and put a wall. So, no, I agree. It's not a high urgency. I don't think so. Or it's probably needs to go first too.
All right, we had a motion to adjourn. So
Who moved to adjourn? I know you second. Oh, you moved and Leah second, okay.
All right, well, thanks for your time meeting.
Great.
Yes.
Somebody grab